Good morning, everyone. As Margie said, I'm Lucas Markson. I'm one of the co-directors of the Climate Change Resource Center. I also lead a group called the Environmental Analysis and Communications Group at the Blasting School for Planning and Public Policy. I'd like to thank Professor Andrews for your inspiring talk. And now it's my pleasure to invite Jesse Jenkins, Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Adlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University, to the podium to talk to us about navigating the emerging federal-state landscape with a focus on accelerating climate mitigation. Jesse?
Okay, we have some big questions ahead of us here in New Jersey, don't we? I think the last time I talked to a New Jersey community like this was a couple years ago, right after passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which presented quite an opportunity for the state to accelerate its clean energy goals. Now we stand in quite a moment of uncertainty about the future of the federal policy environment and certainly lack a willing partner in Washington. So I'm going to focus in this talk mostly on how we rethink, what I think we need is a rethink for our electricity sector decarbonization strategy. I want to note, though, that while this is important, we heard just now that electricity demand is going to grow quite dramatically. The only way we're going to meet our state-level decarbonization goals is if we can accelerate the deployment of clean electricity, that this is not the whole challenge, right? I think I call it the linchpin of the challenge, but I do want to emphasize that there's a lot we should still talk about, and we can do maybe on the panel as well, about how we accelerate the uptake of electrification on the demand side, in providing clean heat for buildings and industry in particular, and how we accelerate and ensure we continue the EV transition despite uncertainty at the federal level. I'm not going to talk about that here, but we should talk about that today. I'm also going to give a shameless plug before I get started. If you're in this room, you'll probably enjoy my podcast, Shift Key, which is a weekly podcast on the energy transition, published by Heat Map News and co-hosted by Robinson Meyer, who is also another New Jerseyan, who is the executive editor at Heat Map. So if you want to find us, go to heatmap.news/podcast or find us in your feed at Apple or Spotify. All right, so to set the stage, a couple years ago, almost 3 now, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 passed at the federal level. And what it effectively does, to sum up a very complicated 1,000-page bill in a simple line, is it puts clean energy on sale for all Americans, right? It's like Black Friday shopping. Everything's now 10 to 50% off. Go wild, right? That's the whole idea of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, is that we need to equalize the incentives between clean and dirty energy. We have 2 ways we can do that, right? We can raise the cost of dirty energy. Not hard to understand why that's politically challenging, or we can lower the cost of clean energy, right? But somehow we have to make the economic incentives line up for the millions of different decisions that you and I and businesses and everyone else makes around the country every day about our energy choices, right? And the only way we're going to see our climate mitigation goals met and the acceleration of the clean energy transition is if we can make it make financial sense at the household table, kitchen table, or at the business boardroom. I've been running a project called the Repeat Project for the last 3 years, 4 years now almost, which tracks the impact of federal energy and climate policies using macro energy system modeling tools that we also use to evaluate potential policies and impacts of new technologies. This is our most recent report from last year. I should note we're about to update this in the next few weeks. But what it shows is that the policies implemented over the last 4 years, including legislation like the IRA and the set of regulations implemented by the Biden administration, effectively double the pace of decarbonization, or roughly double or triple the pace of decarbonization that we were on prior to 2021. That's the current policies band here in the middle. Even that, though, falls short of our objectives at the federal level, which are to cut greenhouse gas emissions to half of our peak levels by 2030, or at least those were our objectives at the federal level. So while we made substantial progress with the current policies in place, what we needed was more at the federal level and state level, not less. So where to now under Trump 2.0? This is exactly the question that Repeat Project is working on answering right now. We're updating all of our assumptions to the latest macroeconomic and technology cost assumptions, and we're beginning to model repeal scenarios. So stay tuned to see what that looks like. My expectation is that the baseline here will shift up as we take into account accelerated demand growth from data centers, which we didn't fully capture in the last report, so that's not great. Everything's going to shift up in terms of emissions. I imagine the current policy's delta will be similar. Under repeal scenarios, which I'll talk about the likelihood of in a second, will probably be somewhere in between that white line and the green line, right? So moving backwards instead of moving forwards, which is what we wanted. So I want to talk about those repeal scenarios. There's sort of three big buckets of policy that have been implemented recently, and they have very different likelihoods of repeal. There's executive actions like regulations implemented by the EPA or the Department of Transportation, energy efficiency standards at the DOE. There's grants and other discretionary spending authorized by the Infrastructure Law or Inflation Reduction Act, which are then executed by executive agencies like the Department of Energy or EPA. And then there's tax credits, which are implemented through the tax code. And I'll break down the chances for repeal for each of those. First, of course, as we know from history, right, executive actions are up to the executive. And so when we see a major change in power in the White House, we can expect major changes in those executive actions. They're simply not very durable. So the immediate expectation is that the Trump administration will begin actions to repeal a range of regulations that were implemented under the Biden administration. That includes EPA regulations on power plants, greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, from vehicles, and oil and gas methane pollution, among others, including certain Department of Energy standards. Now, with the exception of a few of those policies or regulations implemented in the last few days of the Biden administration, which are subject to immediate repeal through the Congressional Review Act, and those have already been nixed in the case, a couple of energy efficiency standards, for example, deregulation requires regulation. So these will have to go through the same administrative procedures as was required to establish the regulations in the first place. That'll take some time, but those processes are beginning now, and we can expect that these rules will be repealed and replaced with something quite a bit weaker, which is exactly what we saw during the first Trump administration. Now, when the Biden administration was wrapping up, it made a major effort to commit a large amount of the roughly $200 billion of discretionary spending that was authorized by the IRA and the infrastructure law to make sure that grants were committed to recipients, that conditional loan guarantees were converted to final commitments. And roughly 85% of that total $200 billion was committed and contracted to various counterparties under a range of different programs. So our public servants under the Biden administration worked their butts off to get as much done as possible before January 20th. Our assumption, most people's assumption going into the Trump administration was that contracts meant something, right? The whole point of a contract is you can't arbitrarily nix it, otherwise why have contracts? Unfortunately, on day one, the Trump administration came in and said, we're going to freeze all federal committed funding. Not just new funding. We were expecting the kind of 15% of uncommitted funds to potentially be repealed or at least used for different purposes. But all of those existing commitments have been frozen, court orders, in a manner that appears to be illegal, right? There are certain contractual clauses that allow for the federal government to, amend or change a contract, but they're not using those procedures. They're simply trying to roll back all of the committed funds. Courts have come in, as in many other actions of this administration, and said, no, that's not legal. But this is a set of aggressive actions that I would say we were not anticipating. I was not anticipating, many others. So that does put that, $160, $170 billion worth of grants and loan guarantees at much more considerable risk. And even if they ultimately go through with those contracts, the chaos and uncertainty that's unfolding right now amongst recipients of those loans may lead to canceled projects and less effective impacts of those grants. And I should say that in many cases, recipients of those funds have already laid out their own money, right, to hire people, order long lead time items, begin site construction, with the assumption that the federal government would honor its word, right? That's something that has been unshakable until this moment. And I should say that the implications of these decisions go much broader than simply whether or not our clean energy transition proceeds. If the federal government can't be trusted to make good on its commitments just because there's a change in administration from one year to the next, how can the federal government do business, period? Right? The good news here, if there is any, is that the bulk of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act acts through the tax code. So most of the impact that we project from repeat project and others project, the bulk of the federal outlays that the Congressional Budget Office estimates, go through tax credits for pretty much everything that we need to accelerate decarbonization. Technology neutral tax credits for carbon-free electricity of all sorts, for energy storage, for sustainable aviation fuels, for carbon capture, for hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And any of those measures have to be repealed legislatively. And of course, the Republican Party has only about a 3-seat majority in both chambers. And so any legislative action effectively has to be unanimous at this point. And so this will take more time. It'll be challenging. The potential repeal of these credits will proceed as part of the reconciliation bill, the budget bill that the House and Senate are working on now, the primary objective of which is to extend the Trump tax cuts from 2017. So that's $4.5 trillion over 10 years that may have to be paid for, plus some additional measures like extension of or ending of taxes on tips and Social Security benefits, which Trump has promised. So the Congress might have to come up with several $1 trillion worth of offsets, and that's where these Inflation Reduction Act tax credits come in. If they're amended or repealed, that can provide some of the revenue. On the other hand, there's really no way to have them add up. There's only about $500 billion in available funding here, so the drop in the bucket for a $5 to $7 trillion bill. At the moment, it seems like what the House and Senate are keen on doing is simply pretending that extending tax cuts is free. So they're talking about changing the budget scoring procedure to adopt a quote-unquote current policy baseline, which is something that's never been done before, which assumes that any current tax credits, if they're extended, do not contribute to the deficit. That's like staying at the Four Seasons for a week and then assuming that I can stay there forever for free. So maybe they'll just adopt an imaginary world where $4.5 trillion goes away and they don't have to raise that money. I have serious concerns about what that means for the federal deficit and our budget responsibility, but it might be the best news of all for the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. All that said, there are substantial economic interests in preserving these tax credits. Over 85% of all the funding and investment incentivized by the IRA has gone into Republican districts. So there are real big businesses here, right? The biggest utility in the country, NextEra, is also the biggest developer of renewable energy. There are big oil and gas company interests in carbon capture, in clean hydrogen. And so there are real substantial business lobbies at play now. The whole automotive industry is committed to electric vehicle manufacturing and has made model decisions and factory decisions that lock them in for the next several years and would like to at least maintain policy continuity for 5-6 years going forward so that those investments are not wasted. So there's a lot of lobbying going on, and there's a lot of reasons why Republicans that have districts that are home to a lot of the economic benefits of these investments might want to not repeal these provisions. And so we've actually seen over 20 House Republicans recently sign a letter to Speaker Johnson calling on them to adopt a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, and preserve most of the measures in the IRA that are driving investment in their districts. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we will not see wholesale repeal of the IRA tax credits, perhaps some strategic or surgical adjustments to their end dates or some of the qualification criteria, a lot of budgetary games, right, that might yield revenue on paper, like sunsetting a tax credit a couple years early, but that don't jeopardize near-term investments. And that might mean that the vast bulk of the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure established by the IRA could be preserved. Right? So we have to keep a close eye on this in New Jersey because this has really fundamental impacts for the cost of our own transition. The clean electricity and electric vehicle tax credits probably being the most salient. Now, the particularly bad news, I think, for New Jersey is that Trump, I think at a very personal level, hates wind power and has unleashed a broad effort across executive agencies to effectively kill any development of offshore wind. This is, again, a pretty clear violation of the standard rule of law. But basically, anywhere the federal government has to make a discretionary decision around permitting that supports offshore wind, I think we can expect a very hostile federal environment for that. And we've already seen that. For example, the EPA repealed some permits for construction at Atlantic Shores last week. And we're going to see more and more of this. And so while offshore wind has already struggled economically with costs rising quite substantially due to inflation and other supply chain challenges to a level that's very hard for me to defend, quite frankly, as an advocate of the clean energy transition. We now have, on top of that, a very hostile federal government that's going to make it very difficult to develop anything in federal waters, which of course is where all of the offshore wind is. So I think we need a fundamental reset here around the role of offshore wind in New Jersey or New York or the other Atlantic states' future. And that's a hard pill to swallow because we've committed quite a lot here to the development of the offshore wind industry. But I think we need to face facts, right? The last offshore wind auctions here in New Jersey and in New York have cleared at roughly $150 to $160 a megawatt hour, if I recall correctly. And that's after application of the 30 to 50% federal investment tax credit. So that means that the unsubsidized cost of offshore wind is now well over $200 per megawatt hour. And that is not a level that will square that triangle, right, of affordability, reliability, and clean energy. That is not an affordable cost for New Jersey to pay to transition. And so we have a choice, do we try to proceed forward and hope that despite opposition at the federal level, despite economic headwinds, that we can drive down the cost of offshore wind dramatically from that $220 a megawatt hour that it costs today, or do we need to pivot to other options? I also want to highlight that New Jersey's other major commitment in clean energy policy so far has been to rooftop and distributed solar, right, which provides about 5% of our overall electricity today and has been growing over time. But if we look at the cost of deploying rooftop solar, particularly residential rooftop solar in New Jersey, it quite simply remains too expensive. We have been paying, on average, $2.60 a watt recently. And, it's down a bit from over $3 a watt for residential rooftop projects. This is the latest average cost from Energy Sage, which aggregates quotes in the region. That is almost 3 times as much as you would have to pay if you lived in Australia. And Australia is not unique in this context. Germany, it costs a little over $1 a watt to deploy rooftop solar. Even the UK, which is not exactly a low-cost environment, it only costs about $1.20 a watt, the equivalent. So we are like 2 to 3 times more expensive here and across the rest of the United States. This is not just a New Jersey problem, than anywhere else in the world that's deploying rooftop solar. So we know it doesn't have to be this way. Right? This is not tariffs, by the way. Tariffs are, a few cents a watt on top of the modules because the modules basically don't cost anything anymore. And so I do think we need to fundamentally revisit our approach to deploying solar in a way that is focused on driving down costs. There is an opportunity to do that. I also want to emphasize that larger scale solar is considerably cheaper. Agrivoltaics that can coexist with our agricultural lands across New Jersey and other large-scale solar projects, which can be sited responsibly in certain locations across the state, are only around $1 to $1.50 a watt, so half the cost of residential rooftop solar. And I've done a lot of analysis. My dissertation was on this, looking at the benefits of distributed solar in terms of offsetting network costs. And I can assure you that there is no way that you can come up with a premium for distributed generation that is equal to 100 or 200% of the value of solar. All right, so I'm going to summarize here at the end a few things I think we need to put on the table for discussion as we revisit New Jersey's energy options. First, I think we need to have a fundamental priority focus not just on deploying rooftop solar, but on making rooftop solar cheap. We should be able to at least have the cost of deploying rooftop solar, which would make it a fundamental, affordable, scalable option for New Jersey going forward. We also simultaneously need to unleash megawatt-scale solar. We passed the Solar Energy Act of 2020 with the goal of doing this, and it has not succeeded yet in driving large-scale solar deployment across the state. We also need to embrace energy storage, of course, as well. We're, of course, part of PJM, and one of the biggest constraints we have is that PJM's interconnection process is fundamentally broken and is not bringing online the large amounts of clean, cheap wind and solar energy and storage across the region that are needed to meet rapid demand growth. And so the state policymakers should be yelling from the rooftops at PJM to fix this problem as we now absorb a 20% rate hike due to the soaring capacity market costs in PJM. It's a problem of their own creation, and they need to fix it. With that in mind, while we want to produce a lot of our energy here in New Jersey, we do need to recognize that we're a small, relatively high-cost state without access to abundant land area and cheap renewables. And so if we can solve interconnection challenges at PJM, we should be thinking about how to strengthen interconnection with our neighbors and importing more cheap, clean energy, that costs $50, $60 a megawatt hour to backfill some of the lost offshore wind. I know that's not as good for local employment, but lowering energy costs is good for employment across the state. And so we need to keep that in mind as we think about these trade-offs. We do need to also consider new nuclear power, right? No one has accused nuclear power of being cheap lately, but again, if you compare the cost of offshore wind at $220 a megawatt hour unsubsidized, even the cost of the new Vogtle reactors, which were, double the cost they should have been, it was estimated to be around $180 to $190 per megawatt hour, and they produce more valuable power for about twice as long as offshore wind. So if we're willing to pay that for offshore wind or rooftop solar at the moment, then we need to be having a fundamental conversation about the role of new nuclear. And in fact, if you look at the draft energy master plan, it includes about 1 gigawatt of new nuclear by 2035 and 4 to 6 gigawatts by 2050. So the modeling that E3 has done for the master plan seems to agree. And finally, I didn't talk a lot about the demand side, but we do need to make sure that we are reforming our electricity rates to match our goals in the 21st century. If we want to promote electrification, if we want to promote flexible consumption of electricity, like managed charging of electric vehicles, if we want to recognize that ground source heat pump, for example, that cuts our peak consumption during peak winter events is a lot more valuable for the grid than just the energy savings we get per kilowatt hour, we have to fundamentally rethink rate design. We can no longer afford to peanut butter around all of these costs in ways that hide the true cost of electricity from consumers. We have to think about cost-reflective rate design and how to deliver that in a way that helps us substantially manage the large-scale growth and demand that is coming while addressing equity concerns. And I've got lots of ideas about how to do that, but I am over time at the moment, and I want to put all these on the table for discussion. Thanks.